The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton's shooting range as Master Sergeant Rodriguez wiped sweat from his brow. The Marine Corps' annual marksmanship competition was in full swing, and tensions ran high among the elite snipers gathered from bases across the country. These were the best of the best, men who could hit a target from over a mile away, warriors whose precision had saved countless lives in combat zones around the world. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the range, her civilian clothes making her stand out among the sea of military uniforms. At 32, she worked as a software engineer for a defense contractor, developing targeting systems for military equipment. Her presence at the base wasn't unusual. She often came to test her programs with real weapons. What was unusual was the conversation she'd been having with her colleague, Dr. James Wu, about the mathematical principles behind ballistics. The Marines had been struggling with a particularly challenging long-range course that morning. The targets were set at varying distances, some as far as 100-200 yards, with wind conditions that changed unpredictably. Even the most experienced snipers were missing shots they would normally make with ease. The course required not just excellent marksmanship, but the ability to quickly calculate wind speed, bullet drop, and atmospheric pressure. Sarah watched as another Marine missed his target, his frustration visible even from a distance. She had been observing the shooters for the past hour, mentally calculating the adjustments they should be making based on the environmental factors she could observe. Her background in physics and her work with ballistic software gave her a unique understanding of the mathematical relationships governing long-range shooting. The wind patterns are creating a venturi effect between those two hills, she explained to Dr. Wu, pointing toward the landscape beyond the targets. The shooters aren't accounting for the way the air currents are being channeled and accelerated through that gap. They're using standard wind reading techniques, but this situation requires a more complex calculation. Dr. Wu nodded, impressed as always by Sarah's analytical mind. He had worked with her for 3 years and had seen her solve problems that stumped entire teams of engineers. Her ability to visualize complex systems and identify variables that others missed was remarkable, but applying that skill to marksmanship was something entirely different. As they watched another Marine struggle with the course, Sarah found herself growing increasingly curious about the practical application of the theories she worked with every day. Her computer simulations were incredibly accurate, but she had never had the opportunity to test her understanding in real-world conditions. The Marines were clearly dealing with factors that their training hadn't fully prepared them for, and Sarah believed she understood what those factors were. The conversation around them had grown heated as senior officers discussed modifying the course. Some argued that the conditions were simply too challenging, that even exceptional marksmen couldn't be expected to perform well under such circumstances. Others insisted that Marines needed to be prepared for any situation they might encounter in the field. Sarah's engineering mind rebelled against the idea that the problem was unsolvable. Every system had variables that could be identified and accounted for. Weather conditions, atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature gradients, wind patterns, these were all measurable phenomena that followed predictable rules. The challenge wasn't that the shots were impossible, but that the shooters weren't accounting for all the relevant factors. She had spent years developing algorithms that could calculate these exact scenarios. Her software could predict bullet trajectories under complex environmental conditions with remarkable accuracy. But there was a significant difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Could someone who had never served in the military, who had learned about ballistics through mathematics rather than training, actually apply that knowledge effectively? The question intrigued her more with each passing minute. She watched the Marines' techniques, noting how they read wind conditions and made their calculations. Their methods were based on experience and training that had been refined over decades. But Sarah could see gaps in their approach, places where additional mathematical considerations could improve their accuracy. As the morning progressed, the competition became increasingly frustrating for everyone involved. The Marines were accustomed to excellence, and their inability to consistently hit targets that should have been within their capabilities was clearly affecting morale. Officers were beginning to discuss whether the course should be modified or abandoned entirely. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She approached Dr. Wu with an idea that seemed almost ridiculous given the circumstances. She wanted to test her theoretical knowledge against the practical skills of the Marine Corps' finest marksmen. It was an unprecedented request, one that would require convincing military personnel to allow a civilian contractor to participate in their training exercise. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge assumptions about expertise, training, and the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical skill. Sarah's background had prepared her for this moment in ways that no one, including herself, fully understood. The mathematical principles she had mastered were about to be put to the ultimate test in conditions that even experienced military snipers found challenging. Sarah's heart raced as she approached the group of frustrated Marines. The logical part of her mind screamed that this was a terrible idea, but her curiosity and confidence in her understanding of ballistics overcame her reservations. She had never fired a military-grade sniper rifle, but she understood the physics behind every shot, better than most people understood basic arithmetic. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was in the middle of a heated discussion with Captain Barnes about whether to call off the exercise when Sarah interrupted. "Excuse me, Sergeant," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I've been watching the shooting and I think I might be able to help." The conversation stopped abruptly. 23 Marines turned to look at the civilian woman who had just suggested she could succeed where they had struggled. Rodriguez's expression shifted from frustration to incredulity. In his 15 years of military service, he had never encountered such a situation. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Rodriguez said, his tone carefully controlled, "this is a military exercise for trained personnel. The weapons and conditions here are extremely dangerous, and these targets require years of specialized training to hit consistently." Sarah nodded respectfully. "I understand your concerns, Sergeant, but I work with ballistics calculations every day. I've been observing the wind patterns and atmospheric conditions, and I believe I can identify the factors that are making this course so challenging. I'd like to request permission to attempt the course." The silence that followed was deafening. Several Marines exchanged glances that mixed amusement with disbelief. Captain Barnes stepped forward, his expression serious. "Ms. Mitchell, I appreciate your confidence, but do you have any idea what you're asking? These are trained killers working with precision instruments. One mistake could be fatal, and frankly, we can't risk having a civilian injured on our range." Dr. Wu moved closer to Sarah, ready to support her if needed, but also concerned about what she was getting herself into. He had seen her solve complex problems before, but this was different. This was about translating theoretical knowledge into physical performance under pressure. "I understand the risks, Captain," Sarah replied, "but I also understand that you're dealing with a complex mathematical problem disguised as a marksmanship challenge. The wind patterns here are creating conditions that standard military training doesn't fully address. I've been calculating the adjustments needed, and I believe I can demonstrate that the shots are achievable with the right approach." Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of the Marines who had been struggling with the course, couldn't contain his skepticism any longer. "Lady, no offense, but you think you can outshoot Marines who've been doing this for over a decade? We've got guys here who've made confirmed kills at distances you've probably never even imagined." Sarah felt the weight of their doubt, but it only strengthened her resolve. "I'm not claiming to be a better shooter than any of you," she said. "I'm suggesting that I might have a different perspective on the problem you're facing. My background in physics and ballistic software development has given me tools for analyzing these conditions that might complement your training." The conversation drew the attention of Colonel Morrison, the commanding officer overseeing the exercise. He had been observing from a distance, but the unusual nature of the discussion brought him over to investigate. Morrison was a veteran with over 25 years of service, and he had seen enough in his career to know that unconventional solutions sometimes came from unexpected sources. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Mitchell?" the colonel asked, his tone neutral but interested. Sarah took a deep breath. "Let me borrow your rifle for a moment," she said, looking directly at Staff Sergeant Martinez. "Give me 5 minutes to demonstrate that the mathematical approach to this problem can work. If I fail, I'll apologize for wasting your time and never bring up the subject again. But if I succeed, maybe we can learn something from each other." The request hung in the air like a challenge that no one had expected. The Marines were caught between their professional pride and their curiosity about whether this civilian could possibly back up her claims. The mathematical confidence in Sarah's voice was unmistakable, but translating equations into accurate shooting was an entirely different matter. Colonel Morrison studied Sarah carefully. He had built his career on making difficult decisions, and something about her quiet confidence reminded him of the kind of analytical thinking that had solved complex problems in the past. The exercise was already a failure by conventional standards, so allowing an unconventional approach carried little additional risk. The safety protocols would need to be strictly followed, the colonel said slowly, and you would need to demonstrate basic weapons handling competency before we could even consider letting you attempt the course. Dr. Wu stepped forward. Colonel, I can vouch for Sarah's analytical abilities. She has an exceptional understanding of physics and mathematics. I've seen her solve problems that stumped entire teams of engineers. Rodriguez shook his head. Colonel, this is highly irregular. We're talking about weapons that can kill at over a mile. Basic competency isn't enough for this kind of precision shooting, which is exactly why it will be so impressive when she hits the targets, Sarah said with a slight smile. Sergeant, I'm not asking you to lower your standards. I'm asking you to let me meet them using a different approach. The challenge was clear, and the Marines found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Their professional expertise was being questioned by someone with no military training, but whose confidence suggested she understood something they didn't. The next few minutes would determine whether Sarah's request would be granted or dismissed as the overconfidence of a civilian who didn't understand what she was asking for. Colonel Morrison made his decision with the kind of calculated risk-taking that had defined his military career. Ms. Mitchell, you'll have exactly one opportunity to prove your point. Staff Sergeant Martinez will supervise weapons handling, and you'll follow every safety protocol to the letter. One mistake and this experiment ends immediately. The range fell silent as word spread that a civilian was about to attempt the course that had frustrated some of the Marine Corps' best marksmen. Soldiers who had been packing their equipment stopped to watch. Officers who had been discussing alternative training plans gathered to observe this unprecedented situation. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her as Martinez reluctantly handed over his rifle. The weapon was heavier than she had expected, its precision engineering evident in every component. She had studied the specifications of this exact model in her software development work, but holding it was an entirely different experience. This is an M40A6 sniper rifle, Martinez explained with professional precision. Effective range of over 1,000 yards, but in these wind conditions you're looking at variables that change every few seconds. The scope is zeroed for standard conditions, but you'll need to account for temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed at multiple points along the bullet's trajectory. Sarah nodded, her mind already processing the information. What's the ammunition specification? She asked, running her hands along the rifle's stock to familiarize herself with its balance. 6.2mm NATO rounds, 175 grain boat tail, Martinez replied, somewhat surprised by the technical nature of her question. Muzzle velocity of approximately 2,550 feet per second. As Sarah examined the weapon, her engineering mind cataloged every relevant factor. The rifle's weight would affect her ability to hold it steady. The trigger pull would need to be smooth and consistent. The scope's magnification would determine how precisely she could aim. But most importantly, she needed to calculate the environmental factors that were causing the Marines to miss. She spent several minutes observing the wind patterns, noting how the vegetation moved at different distances and elevations. Her years of working with atmospheric modeling software had taught her to recognize subtle indicators that revealed complex air currents. What looked like simple wind to most observers was actually a three-dimensional puzzle of pressure differentials and thermal effects. The temperature gradient between the ground and the air at target level is creating a thermal layering effect, she explained to Martinez as she continued her observations. Combined with the ventry effect from those hills, the wind speed is varying by almost 15% at different points along the trajectory path. Martinez found himself genuinely interested, despite his skepticism. How are you calculating that without instruments? The movement of the grass at 400 yards versus the tree branches at 800 yards tells me the wind speed is different at those elevations, Sarah replied. The heat shimmer pattern visible through the scope indicates the thermal layers. It's like reading the atmosphere's fingerprint. She knelt into a shooting position, feeling awkward with the unfamiliar stance but trying to apply the stability principles she understood from physics. The rifle needed to be supported in a way that minimized movement while allowing for precise adjustments. Her lack of muscle memory for this specific task was obvious. but her understanding of mechanical stability helped compensate. The first target was at 600 yards, considered a moderate distance for trained snipers, but challenging enough under current conditions. Sarah peered through the scope, making fine adjustments to account for the factors she had calculated. The crosshairs wavered slightly as she tried to control her breathing and heartbeat. "Remember, the trigger pull should be straight back, steady pressure," Martinez coached, his professional instincts overriding his doubts about her chances of success. Sarah focused on the mathematical problem rather than the pressure of being watched by dozens of skeptical Marines. The bullet would drop approximately 18 inches over 600 yards under standard conditions, but she needed to account for the current atmospheric pressure, temperature, and humidity. More importantly, she had to compensate for the wind drift that had been causing the Marines problems all morning. She made her calculations, adjusted her aim point, and slowly increased pressure on the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Through the scope, she watched the bullet's trace and saw it strike the target just left of center. A murmur went through the crowd of observers. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it was significantly better than most of the attempts they had witnessed that morning. More importantly, Sarah's adjustment had been in the right direction, suggesting that her analysis of the conditions was accurate. Wind compensation was close, but I underestimated the crosswind component, she said, more to herself than to Martinez. The bullet drift was about 2 inches less than I calculated. Martinez stared at the target through his binoculars. "That was actually a decent shot," he admitted grudgingly. "But one hit doesn't prove anything. The conditions change constantly out here." Sarah nodded, already recalculating based on the information she had gained from her first attempt. She now had real-world data to refine her theoretical calculations. The difference between her predicted impact and the actual result gave her valuable feedback about how to adjust her approach for the remaining targets. The second target was at 800 yards, significantly more challenging. Sarah spent more time observing the wind patterns at that distance, noting how the air currents behaved differently as they passed over varied terrain. Her mathematical mind processed multiple variables simultaneously, creating a complex equation that accounted for factors the Marines had been estimating rather than calculating. As she prepared for her second shot, the skeptical murmurs from the crowd began to fade. The Marines were starting to realize that they might be witnessing something extraordinary. The second shot rang out across the range, and this time Sarah's bullet struck dead center. The target, located 800 yards away through swirling wind conditions that had challenged experienced snipers all morning, showed a perfect hit that would have impressed even under ideal circumstances. The silence that followed was different from before. Where there had been skeptical murmurs, now there was genuine attention. Colonel Morrison lowered his binoculars with a thoughtful expression, while several Marines exchanged glances that mixed surprise with professional interest. "That was no accident," Staff Sergeant Martinez said quietly, studying the target through his scope. "She's actually reading these conditions better than we have been." Sarah remained focused on her task, already analyzing the feedback from her second shot to refine her calculations further. The bullet had performed exactly as her math predicted, confirming that her approach to reading the environmental factors was sound. More importantly, she was beginning to understand how her theoretical knowledge translated into practical application. The key is treating each shot as a separate mathematical problem rather than relying on general compensation rules, she explained to Martinez as she prepared for the third target. "Every few hundred yards, the atmospheric conditions change enough to require new calculations." Dr. Wu watched with amazement as his colleague applied her analytical skills to a completely unfamiliar challenge. He had seen her solve complex engineering problems, but this demonstration of her ability to transfer that knowledge to an entirely different field was remarkable. The third target sat at 1,000 yards, a distance where even small errors in calculation could result in complete misses. At this range, the bullet would be in flight for over a second, giving atmospheric conditions more time to affect its trajectory. Sarah spent considerable time studying the terrain between her position and the target, noting how the landscape would influence wind patterns and thermal effects. "At this distance, you're not just shooting at a target," she said, half to herself and half to Martinez. "You're shooting through a constantly changing three-dimensional environment that affects every inch of the bullet's path." She made minute adjustments to her scope settings, compensating not just for bullet drop, but for the Coriolis effect that became significant at longer ranges. Her calculations included factors that most shooters handled through experience and intuition rather than precise mathematical analysis. The third shot was another center hit. The crowd of Marines had grown larger as word spread throughout the base about what was happening at the range. Officers who had never seen anything like this were calling colleagues to witness a civilian outperforming military specialists using nothing but mathematical calculations and basic shooting technique. Captain Barnes shook his head in disbelief. In 20 years of military service, I've never seen anything like this. She's treating marksmanship like an engineering problem and solving it better than trained snipers. Sarah's confidence grew with each successful shot, but not because of ego or pride. Instead, she felt the satisfaction of seeing theoretical knowledge prove itself in practical application. Every hit confirmed that the principles she worked with in software development were accurate representations of real-world physics. The fourth target was positioned at 1,200 yards, at the extreme edge of the course. This distance pushed the limits of both the rifle's capability and the shooter's skill. Environmental factors that were minor considerations at shorter ranges became major variables that could cause complete misses if not properly accounted for. This is where it gets really interesting, Sarah said, spending extra time with her calculations. At this range, I need to account for the Earth's rotation, atmospheric density variations, and wind patterns that exist in 3 dimensions rather than just horizontally. Martinez found himself genuinely learning from her approach. How are you calculating all of this without computers or weather instruments? The same way you calculate wind drift, but with more variables, Sarah replied. I'm using observable indicators to estimate atmospheric conditions, then applying mathematical models to predict how they'll affect bullet trajectory. It's like weather forecasting, but for a very specific path through the atmosphere. She made her preparations methodically, double-checking each calculation before committing to her aim point. The mathematical complexity of the shot fascinated her, representing the kind of multivariable problem that she encountered in her engineering work, but applied to an entirely different field. The fourth shot was another perfect hit. By now, the gathering of Marines included senior officers from other units who had heard about the extraordinary demonstration taking place. The story was already spreading beyond the range, with personnel throughout the base talking about the civilian woman who was outperforming Marine snipers using mathematical calculations. She's not just hitting targets, observed Major Thompson, who had arrived to see what was causing the commotion. She's hitting them with consistency that suggests she's solved the environmental puzzle that's been challenging our people all morning. Sarah prepared for the fifth target, aware that she was being watched by dozens of military personnel, but remaining focused on the mathematical challenge. Each shot had provided data that refined her understanding of the current conditions, allowing her to improve her calculations with each attempt. The fifth target was at an intermediate distance but positioned to take advantage of the most challenging wind conditions on the range. It was specifically placed where multiple terrain features created complex air currents that were difficult to read and compensate for. As Sarah studied the target area, she realized that this shot would require her most sophisticated calculations yet. The wind patterns here were three-dimensional and constantly changing, requiring her to predict not just current conditions but how they would evolve during the bullet's flight time. Her fifth shot struck the target perfectly, and the crowd of observers began to understand that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. As Sarah approached the final target, the atmosphere on the range had transformed completely. What had begun as skeptical tolerance of an unusual request had evolved into genuine respect for an extraordinary demonstration of applied mathematics. The Marines who had initially doubted her capabilities were now studying her technique, trying to understand how she was achieving results that had eluded their traditional training methods. The sixth and final target represented the ultimate challenge of the course. Positioned at 100 yards but placed in a location where multiple environmental factors converged to create the most difficult shooting conditions possible. This target had not been successfully hit by any Marine that morning. The combination of distance, wind patterns, and thermal effects made it a near-impossible shot under current conditions. Colonel Morrison approached Sarah as she prepared for her final attempt. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with this last shot, you've already demonstrated something remarkable here today. Your approach has given us insights that could improve our training methods significantly." Sarah nodded respectfully, but her focus remained on the mathematical challenge ahead. The final target required her to synthesize everything she had learned from the previous 5 shots, while accounting for the most complex environmental conditions on the range. It was exactly the kind of multivariable problem that she found most intellectually stimulating. This target sits in a convergence zone where 3 different wind patterns meet, she explained to the gathered Marines. The thermal updrafts from that rocky outcropping interact with the crosswinds from the valley, while the downdrafts from the ridge create a constantly shifting 3-dimensional puzzle. She spent nearly 10 minutes analyzing the conditions, making calculations that went far beyond anything taught in standard marksmanship training. Her approach treated the atmosphere as a complex fluid dynamics problem, using mathematical models to predict how air currents would affect her bullet's trajectory. Staff Sergeant Martinez watched her work with growing admiration. "You're not just shooting," he observed. "You're engineering each shot based on real-time environmental analysis." "Every shot is a physics experiment," Sarah replied, continuing her calculations. "The atmosphere between here and that target is like a 3-dimensional equation with constantly changing variables. The trick is identifying the patterns within the chaos." As she prepared for her final shot, Sarah reflected on how her unconventional background had prepared her for this moment. Her years of developing ballistic software had given her an intuitive understanding of how multiple variables interacted to affect projectile trajectories. Her work with atmospheric modeling had taught her to recognize subtle indicators of air pressure and wind patterns. Most importantly, her engineering training had taught her to approach complex problems systematically rather than relying solely on experience or intuition. The Marines gathered around the range represented decades of military training and combat experience, yet they found themselves learning from someone who had never served in the military. It was a powerful demonstration of how different types of expertise could complement each other when applied to shared challenges. Sarah settled into her shooting position for the final time, making minute adjustments to account for the specific conditions affecting this particular target. Her calculations included factors that even experienced snipers often handled through approximation rather than precise mathematical analysis. The atmosphere on the range was electric with anticipation. Word had spread throughout the base about the civilian who was accomplishing what trained Marines had found impossible. Personnel from other units had gathered to witness the conclusion of this unprecedented demonstration. Wind speed varying between 8 and 12 miles per hour depending on elevation, Sarah said quietly, more to organize her own thoughts than to inform the observers. Temperature differential of approximately 4 degrees between ground level and target height. Atmospheric pressure holding steady, but thermal layering creating density variations that will affect trajectory. She made her final adjustments and slowly increased pressure on the trigger. The shot rang out across the range, and through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet's path toward the target that had defied every previous attempt. That morning, the impact was perfect, dead center. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before the range erupted in applause and amazed conversation. Marines who had spent years perfecting their marksmanship skills were witnessing a perfect demonstration of how mathematical precision could achieve results that exceeded traditional training methods. Sarah had successfully hit all 6 targets, each one representing a different challenge in terms of distance and environmental conditions. More remarkably, she had achieved this performance on her first attempt at long-range shooting, using only mathematical calculations to overcome the atmospheric conditions that had frustrated experienced snipers all morning. Colonel Morrison approached Sarah with an expression that mixed professional respect with genuine amazement. "Ms. Mitchell, in 30 years of military service, I have never seen anything quite like what you've accomplished here today. You've demonstrated that there are approaches to marksmanship that our traditional training methods haven't fully explored." The implications of Sarah's performance extended far beyond a single successful shooting demonstration. She had shown that mathematical analysis could enhance military training, that civilian expertise could contribute to military capabilities, and that unconventional approaches to traditional challenges could yield extraordinary results. As the Marines began to discuss the lessons learned from watching her technique, Sarah realized that her simple request to borrow your rifle for a moment had turned into something much more significant than she had ever anticipated. The news of Sarah's remarkable achievement spread throughout Camp Pendleton within hours, and by the end of the week, her story had reached military training facilities across the country. The civilian software engineer who had outperformed Marine snipers, using mathematical calculations, became a legend that challenged traditional assumptions about expertise and training methodologies. Colonel Morrison wasted no time in documenting the event and its implications. His report to headquarters detailed not just Sarah's perfect performance, but the analytical approach she had used to achieve it. The military's interest extended beyond the novelty of the situation to the practical applications of her methods for improving marksmanship training programs. Within a month, Sarah received an invitation to participate in a joint military-civilian research project focused on integrating mathematical modeling into sniper training curricula. The Marine Corps wanted to understand how her approach could be taught to military personnel, potentially revolutionizing how they prepared marksmen for complex environmental conditions. "What you demonstrated wasn't just exceptional shooting," explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the military psychologist assigned to analyze the event. "You showed that mathematical thinking could compensate for limited physical experience when applied to technical challenges. That has implications for training efficiency that we're only beginning to understand." Sarah found herself consulting with military training facilities on developing new approaches to marksmanship education. Her work involved creating mathematical models that could help snipers understand atmospheric effects more precisely, reducing the time required to develop expert-level skills through pure experience. The story also had profound effects on the Marines who witnessed it. Staff Sergeant Martinez became one of the most vocal advocates for incorporating mathematical analysis into traditional shooting instruction. His own performance improved dramatically after Sarah taught him to quantify environmental factors rather than estimate them through experience alone. "She changed how I think about every shot," Martinez explained to new recruits during training sessions. "Instead of guessing at wind compensation, I now calculate it. Instead of approximating atmospheric effects, I measure them. The difference in consistency is remarkable." Dr. Wu watched his colleague's transformation from software engineer to military consultant with amazement. Sarah's willingness to test her theoretical knowledge in practical application had opened doors to collaborations that neither of them had imagined possible. The broader implications of Sarah's achievement extended beyond military training. Her story became a case study in universities and business schools about the value of applying expertise across disciplines. Engineers began looking for opportunities to test their theoretical knowledge in practical settings, while military trainers started seeking input from civilian specialists in related fields. Sarah's approach also influenced the development of new training technologies. Her mathematical models were incorporated into simulation software that allowed snipers to practice complex calculations in virtual environments before applying them on actual ranges. This innovation significantly reduced the time and ammunition required to develop expert-level skills. The psychological impact of her demonstration was equally significant. She had proven that expertise could transfer across disciplines when the underlying principles were properly understood. This realization encouraged collaboration between military and civilian specialists in numerous other fields, from logistics to communications to strategic planning. Years later, the story of Sarah's perfect shooting demonstration continued to inspire both military personnel and civilian professionals. Military academies used her achievement as an example of how mathematical thinking could enhance traditional training methods, while engineering schools cited her story as evidence of how theoretical knowledge could have practical applications in unexpected areas. Sarah herself remained humble about her achievement, always emphasizing that her success had been made possible by the foundational work of the Marines, who had developed the training methods and equipment she had used. She viewed her contribution not as superior to their expertise, but as complementary to it. "I didn't replace traditional training methods," she often explained during speaking engagements. "I added mathematical precision to techniques that were already fundamentally sound. The Marines had created an excellent foundation. I just applied engineering principles to optimize the results." The lasting legacy of that morning at Camp Pendleton was a new understanding of how different types of expertise could be combined to achieve results that exceeded what either approach could accomplish alone. Sarah's perfect shooting demonstration had begun with a simple request to borrow a rifle. But it ended with fundamental changes in how the military approached training and how civilian specialists viewed their potential contributions to fields outside their traditional domains. The Marines gained new training methods that improved their marksmanship capabilities, while Sarah discovered applications for her mathematical skills that she had never considered. Most importantly, both communities learned that the boundaries between different types of expertise were more permeable than they had previously understood. The woman who had asked to borrow your rifle for a moment had proven that sometimes the most profound innovations come from the most unexpected sources, and that true expertise lies not just in what you know, but in how creatively and courageously you're willing to apply that knowledge to new challenges.